The Pest and Predator podcast is brought to you by Field Heroes, powered by the Western Grains Research Foundation. Visit fieldheroes.ca to learn how beneficial insects can benefit your farm. Welcome to the Pest and Predator podcast, brought to you by Field Heroes, powered by the Western Grains Research Foundation. Visit fieldheroes.ca to learn how beneficial insects can benefit your farm. Today's guest on the Pest and Predator podcast is John Gavloski. He's an entomologist with Manitoba Agriculture and Resource Development. Hey, John, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How about you?
I'm doing fantastic. I'm really looking forward to this discussion on grasshopper eggs. So first, why should growers be on the lookout for these pests?
Okay, so when we get high grasshopper levels, we often start to see other insects as well. Now, grasshoppers are major pests, and the species that we're dealing with in the prairies, we've got 4 species we consider pests. 3 of them are very general in their feeding habits. They can damage a lot of crops. So it's good that we have some beneficial insects that can help contain their populations.
Yeah, I didn't actually realize it, but grasshopper eggs they're a significant dietary supplement for a lot of insects that are out in the field.
That's right. Yeah, grasshoppers and their eggs, they're food for many other animals, and some insects actually make grasshopper eggs kind of a staple or a large part of their diet. So getting to know some of these predators and their life cycles not only is it interesting, but it's also very good to help us with our grasshopper decision making.
So, from a farmer perspective, are we trying to control grasshopper populations when they get above threshold levels, but not necessarily do anything to the eggs, or what's the consideration there?
So, grasshopper control is aimed at either the juvenile nymphs or the adults. For all of our pest species, the egg stage is in the ground. We've got over 180 species of grasshoppers in Canada. 4 of those we consider pests. They all lay their eggs in the soil, usually starting in August, September is when the egg laying is happening. They're a few centimeters down into the soil, so you'd never control those with insecticides. However, there are insects that are very good at getting down into the soil to those eggs and can provide at least some level of control.
So is it true the individual eggs for the grasshoppers actually look a little bit like almost like rice?
Yeah, so an individual egg looks like a grain of brown rice, essentially. However, you'll never see an individual egg. Usually what the female does is it lays a cluster of, it can be anywhere from about 20 to about 50 or more eggs. We call them an egg pod. And so these eggs are all stuck together. The grasshopper coats them with a frothy secretion, and so they're all kind of stuck together into this pod that's laid in the soil. Okay,
so John, tell me a little bit about the natural predators of grasshopper eggs.
Yeah, so what I wanted to cover was 4 groups of insects that are very good at finding and eating these eggs. And a couple of these groups, you often see higher levels when you start seeing a lot of grasshoppers. And the first one I want to touch on is bee flies. So bee flies, we've got 105 species of these in Canada, so they're a very diverse group. Generally, they look like bees, hence the name. They're usually very stout-bodied, they're hairy, and good bee mimics. They're very palatable to anything that wants to eat them, but they look like bees, so it kind of helps protect them. You often see the adults feeding on flowers. They're feeding on both nectar and the pollen. And when you see them feeding, they've got long proboscis or feeding tube, and it's not flexible like butterflies and a lot of other insects. So you have this bee-like insect with this stout long proboscis sticking out and feeding on the flower. So that's the adult stage. That's what you're going to see. However, the eggs are laid on the soil, and it's the larvae of the bee flies that eat the grasshopper eggs. The bee fly adults are very good at tracking and detecting where the female grasshoppers are laying their eggs. And so the bee fly will lay its eggs right next to the grasshopper egg pods. When the eggs of the bee flies hatch, they make their way to the egg pods, and it's the larvae of the bee flies that will consume the grasshopper eggs. And many species of bee flies, grasshopper eggs are one of the sole things in their diet.
Oh, interesting. What about the blister beetle?
So blister beetles are a really interesting group. The adults can cause blisters. The larvae have very bizarre life cycles where their form and appearance can change quite a bit once they find their food. And the life cycles of a lot of species are correlated quite well with those of grasshoppers. Now, we've got 46 species of blister beetles in Canada. So, again, they're a fairly diverse group. Not all feed on grasshopper eggs, but there's a group or genus called Epicauda. And this group includes a black species and a gray species that we were seeing a lot of over the past year. And once again, it's the larvae that are eating their grasshopper eggs. For you to be able to recognize an adult blister beetle, you're looking for beetles that they're quite long and narrow. The body's often quite soft and flexible, which is unlike many beetles. And the part in behind the head that we call a pronotum is narrower than the head and the wings. So that's a very generalized description of them. Once again, the females will be laying their eggs in clusters on the soil. When the eggs hatch, the larvae of the blister beetles are very active. They've got long legs, and they're good at crawling, and they can find their way to where the grasshopper egg pods are. Now, once they find the grasshopper egg pod, they're basically set for life. They've got their food supply for pretty much their whole larval life. So their form and appearance will change. Once they start molting, they lose their legs, essentially. They have no need to move around anymore. So they're just going to spend the rest of their larval stage hanging out on that grasshopper egg pod and destroying the eggs that are inside.
You know what? The life cycle, we're talking about blister beetles specifically here. That is a really, I don't think there's a lot of farmers that are aware of all this activity that is actually happening in their fields.
Probably not. And it might be hard to make that association between the black blister beetles and grasshopper eggs. Normally when you see these blister beetles, they're on the flowers or the foliage of, say, a canola plant or an alfalfa plant or something, and you might even think that they're doing some harm to your crops. Usually they're not, but yeah, it's hard to know that these insects also have a good side and can help control our grasshoppers.
Okay, next on the list is field crickets. They're a beneficial insect that's attacking the grasshopper eggs as well?
Yeah, so most people are familiar with what a field cricket looks like, and often the same conditions that result in lots of grasshoppers do result in lots of field crickets. Now, field crickets are they're very general in their feeding habits. They will eat plant food, dried plant vegetation. They will actually dig into the soil and even climb vegetation to eat other insects, usually small insects, insect pupa that are in the soil. And there's been some studies that have shown that they can dig down and will purposely dig up and eat grasshopper egg pods. One of the studies that looked at this more intensively was done in Alberta, and they noticed that there was a lot of crickets hanging around one of the egg beds for the grasshoppers, and they actually collected 22 crickets that were hanging out in this area.
Oh, wow.
And they were dissecting their stomachs and looking for grasshopper eggs in their stomachs. Now, 5 of the crickets hadn't been feeding. They were probably going through a molt or something, so they really don't count. But of the 17 remaining, 11 of them had grasshopper eggs in their stomachs.
That doesn't sound like a very fun afternoon going through cricket stomachs looking for grasshopper eggs, John, but it takes all kinds.
Yeah, and hey, that's the kind of thing that entomologists do when we're bored.
That's a weekend activity for you?
Well, you bet.
Okay, finally, ground beetles. Tell us about them.
So ground beetles are a real interesting group. First, they're hugely diverse. We've got 983 species in Canada. So to put that into perspective, there's more species of ground beetles than there are birds. So they're a very diverse group. To see them, you almost have to disturb them during the day. They're nocturnal. They feed at night, and they hide during the day. So when you turn over a board or kick over a clump of soil or something, you'll often see these black or brown, fairly large beetles that scurry around. Those are likely ground beetles. Again, they're very diverse. And if you were to look carefully at them, you'd notice they've got very large eyes. They've got these long, spiny legs, so they're very good at running. And they've got very large jaws. Most of them are predators, so their large jaws help them catch prey and feed. And some species are actually weed seed predators as well. So in addition, they'll eat some weed seeds. Now, not all species of ground beetles eat grasshopper egg pods. Some of them prefer to feed more at the surface level. A few species will climb plants looking for food. And there's a few species. There's a genus called Pterostichus. And some of these larger ground beetles, they are known to dig into the soil and feed on things like grasshopper egg pods. And a study done in Manitoba, very similar to the cricket study in Alberta, they noticed there was a lot of these Pterostichus ground beetles hanging out in an area where there were a lot of grasshopper eggs. So they collected some. They did some laboratory studies where they actually buried grasshopper eggs in the soil, and then they gave the ground beetles alternative food sources that were easy to access, and they actually preferred to be digging into the soil and feeding onto egg pods. Must be a lot of nutrition in the egg pods because the ground beetles were digging down and preferentially feeding on them.
So now that we've reviewed these beneficial insects, what should farmers do about this, John? Should they be out scouting for these beneficials before they try to control the grasshopper population?
So we encourage farmers to be out scouting for grasshoppers just in general, especially in years when their populations are high. Usually we want them to start in June and continue throughout the season. Now, when you're scouting for grasshoppers, be on the lookout for some of these beneficial insects. If you know you've got a good population of beneficial insects in the area, they're your frontline workers. So those are your farm hands that are your first line of defense against grasshoppers. So you want to do everything you can to encourage them and help them do their job. There are likely going to be times when grasshopper control is needed regardless. You certainly don't want to get into a situation where you're losing a lot of your yield because of them. If you do need to spray, and you know that there's a lot of natural enemies in the area, there's things you can do to try to minimize the risk to the natural enemies. So you can, first of all, use the economic thresholds that are out there, only spray if needed. But if you do have to spray, sometimes there's selective insecticides that could be an option. So selective insecticides, they target things like grasshoppers. They do less harm to a lot of your beneficial insects.
Yeah, because I think that's the big consideration a lot of farmers have is they know that grasshoppers, when that population is really significant, they can take a field fast. We've all seen that, and so time is of the essence. It's that balance between helping and managing those beneficial populations and trying to erode the grasshopper population that is out there trying to destroy the crop.
That's exactly it, and that's what we encourage. You certainly need to control pests when they're at levels where they're going to be doing economic damage to your crop, but applying insecticides when they're not really needed or under the wrong circumstances can sometimes do more harm than good.
Okay, John, finally here, where are the resources? If I'm trying to scout for these beneficials, is there like pictures I can use to identify them, or what are some resources there?
Yeah, so there's various websites where you can find good pictures of some of these beneficials. The Field Heroes series, they've got a website, and there's pictures of many of the beneficial insects on that website with write-ups on what they feed on and how much they consume. A lot of the provincial agriculture websites also have fact sheets that contain beneficial insects and information on them as well. So those are a couple of sources that people can go to if they want more information.
Great stuff. Hey, John, thanks a lot.
Okay, you're welcome.
Pest and Predator Podcast is brought to you by Field Heroes, powered by the Western Grains Research Foundation. Visit fieldheroes.ca to learn how beneficial insects can benefit your farm.